The morning sun peeked through the tall windows of the county courthouse as people filed in, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. Among them was a woman in her mid-30s, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans and a plain navy sweater, not her usual work clothes, but she hadn't had time to change. She'd been up all night on a security assignment and came straight to court to deal with her traffic ticket. She glanced at her watch and sighed. The presidential visit was just days away, and her mind was swimming with security protocols and staff assignments. As team lead, she needed to make sure everything went perfectly. This court appearance was the last thing she needed today. The wooden benches were already filling up with people, some looking nervous, others bored. An older man in a worn jacket tapped his foot impatiently. A young couple whispered to each other, checking the time every few minutes. The room smelled of floor polish and coffee from the paper cups people carried in. Just get through this quickly, she thought to herself, reviewing what she would say about the ticket. She had been rushing to an emergency call when she was pulled over for speeding. There were specific rules that covered federal agents in these situations, rules she knew well. She flipped through her papers while the clerk called name after name. The judge, a thin man with silver hair and glasses perched on his nose, handled each case briskly. Some people left looking relieved, others disappointed. Traffic violations, next 5 cases, the clerk announced. She gathered her paperwork, the citation, her documentation about the emergency call, and the legal statute that covered her situation. What should have been straightforward suddenly felt complicated as fatigue washed over her. 26 hours without sleep was catching up to her. The bailiff called her name, and she stood up, smoothing her sweater. As she walked forward, she noticed the judge looking her up and down with a slight frown. His eyebrows raised just enough to show his disapproval of her casual appearance. This shouldn't take long, she told herself, approaching the bench with the confidence that came from years of high-pressure situations. Little did she know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Behind her, the courtroom doors opened again, letting in a blast of cool air and more people rushing to make their appointments. The clerk shuffled papers, the judge cleared his throat, and the day's drama was about to unfold in a way nobody in that courtroom could possibly expect. Case number 47B, the clerk announced in a monotone voice. She walked forward with steady steps despite her exhaustion. The polished wood barrier separating the public from the court officials gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The judge looked down from his high bench, his eyes narrowing as he took in her casual clothes. "You're appearing before this court. Dressed like that?" he asked, voice dripping with disapproval. Several heads turned to look at her. The judge tapped his pen against his notepad. "This is a court of law, not a coffee shop." She opened her mouth to explain, but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Let me see your citation," he said, holding out his hand. The bailiff took her paperwork and passed it to the judge, who flipped through it with obvious impatience. "Speeding, 47 miles per hour in a 30 zone," he read aloud, peering at her over his glasses. "Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, Your Honor, but if I could explain the circumstances." "I'm sure you think your reasons are very special," he interrupted, his tone making it clear he didn't think so at all. "Everyone who comes before me has a story about why the rules shouldn't apply to them." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the front row looked down at her hands. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine, her face carefully blank. "Your Honor, I'm familiar with traffic regulations, and there's actually a specific exemption that applies in this case," she began, keeping her voice respectful despite the growing knot of frustration in her stomach. The judge's eyebrows shot up so high, they nearly reached his hairline. "Oh, are you now? Familiar with traffic regulations?" He glanced around the courtroom as if inviting everyone to share in his amusement. "Perhaps you'd like to come up here and do my job since you're so well versed in the law?" Several people laughed nervously. The clerk looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. "That's not what I meant, Your Honor," she said, feeling heat rise to her face. Not from embarrassment, she'd faced down armed threats without blinking, but from the effort of maintaining her composure. People come in here every day thinking they know better than the system that's been in place for decades, the judge continued, warming to his topic. Maybe if you dressed appropriately for court, I might believe you understand the seriousness of these proceedings. The bailiff's radio crackled, drawing a sharp look from the judge. The sound seemed to emphasize the tension that had fallen over the room. She stood tall, hands at her sides, face neutral despite the unfair treatment. Years of training had taught her how to remain calm when others lost their cool. Your Honor, with all due respect, she tried again. Respect seems to be precisely what you're lacking, he cut in sharply. Perhaps we need to evaluate whether you even understand the basic functioning of our justice system. That was the moment everything changed. Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of his superiority, made her decision easy. Without breaking eye contact, she reached slowly into her bag. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. The judge's eyes widened slightly. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, but she simply pulled out a small leather wallet and held it in her hand, not opening it yet. Your Honor, I've been trying to explain that there's a legal exemption that applies to my situation. The judge's face reddened. I don't need a lecture on the law from someone who can't even bother to dress properly for court. His voice rose as he continued. Do you think special rules apply to you? That somehow the laws that govern everyone else don't matter in your case? A man in the back row whispered something to his companion. The court reporter's fingers moved rapidly across her machine, capturing every word of the increasingly tense exchange. Actually, Your Honor, in this specific instance, there are special rules that apply. Her voice remained steady and professional despite the judge's growing anger. Is that so? The judge leaned forward, his hands flat on the bench. And what makes you so special? What outstanding qualification do you possess that puts you above the law? She took a deep breath. She hadn't wanted things to go this way. In her 10 years of service, she'd rarely had to pull rank in civilian settings, but the judge had left her no choice with his assumptions and attitude. Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be above the law. I'm simply referring to Section 3056 of Title 18, which provides exemptions for federal agents in the performance of protective duties. The judge's eyebrows furrowed. Are you a lawyer now, too? Quoting legal codes in my courtroom? He looked at the citation again. There's nothing here about any federal agent status. An older woman in the jury box waiting for another trial to begin watched with undisguised interest. The clerk had stopped pretending to shuffle papers and was openly staring. I was hoping to handle this discreetly, she said. But since you've questioned my understanding of the legal system, I should clarify my position. The judge waved his hand dismissively. By all means, enlighten us all. His sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. At the time of this citation, I was responding to an urgent call related to my duties. I was driving back from an overnight security detail and received an alert requiring immediate response. She spoke clearly, making sure everyone could hear her. I'm not asking for special treatment because of who I am. I'm simply pointing out that there are legal provisions for this exact situation. And what situation might that be? The judge asked, his voice dripping with condescension. What job is so important that traffic laws don't apply? She'd faced down threats that would make most people crumble. She'd protected high-ranking officials in volatile situations around the world. But something about this man's smugness, his absolute certainty that she couldn't possibly know what she was talking about, made her blood boil. Your Honor, with respect, before you continue, you should know who you're addressing. Oh? And who exactly am I addressing? He asked with mock curiosity, looking around the courtroom as if inviting everyone to share in the joke. Someone who thinks a courtroom is like a casual Friday at the office? Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere had grown unbearably tense. An attorney waiting for the next case looked at his watch and then back at the unfolding drama, clearly sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. She stood tall, shoulders back, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. When she spoke, again her voice was calm but carried throughout the room. Your Honor, I had hoped to handle this matter without bringing attention to my position, but since you insist on questioning my credibility and understanding of the law—" She paused, meeting the judge's gaze directly. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room began to shift in a way no one could have anticipated. The leather wallet in her hand felt heavy with meaning. She flipped it open in one smooth motion, revealing a gleaming badge and identification card. "I'm a special agent with the United States Secret Service, currently assigned to the Presidential Protection Detail," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "The night before this citation was issued, I was on an overnight security assignment preparing for the president's upcoming visit to this city." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. You could have heard a pin drop. The judge's face went from red to white in seconds. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The pen he'd been tapping impatiently against his notepad slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the bench. I wasn't aware," he stammered, suddenly looking smaller in his black robe. "No, Your Honor, you weren't," she replied calmly, "because you didn't allow me to explain." The bailiff leaned forward to get a better look at her credentials, his expression shifting from suspicion to surprise and then respect. The court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers frozen above her machine. "As I was trying to explain," she continued, her voice steady, "federal law provides specific exemptions for agents in the course of protective duties. The citation was issued while I was responding to an alert about a potential security breach. I came to court today directly from another overnight shift, which is why I'm not dressed in formal attire." The judge cleared his throat, clearly trying to regain his composure. "I see," he said, his voice noticeably softer. "And you have documentation of this assignment?" "Yes, Your Honor." She handed over another paper from her folder. "This is the incident report with all sensitive information redacted. You'll also find a copy of the federal statute I mentioned earlier, Section 3056 of Title 18. The judge took the papers with slightly trembling hands. The change in his demeanor was so dramatic, it was almost comical. Several people in the courtroom exchanged glances. An older gentleman in the back whispered audibly to his companion, "Didn't see that coming, did you?" The judge skimmed the documents, his eyes widening as he read. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance, somehow emphasizing the importance of what was happening inside the courtroom. "Agent," the judge finally said, deliberately avoiding looking her in the eye, "these documents appear to be in order." He handed them back with newfound respect, perhaps even a touch of fear. "Based on the federal exemption clearly outlined here, this case is dismissed." She accepted the papers with a professional nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Just as she turned to leave, the judge cleared his throat again. "Agent," he called after her. When she turned back, he seemed to be struggling with himself. He paused, then continued in a subdued voice. "The court appreciates your service." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as someone like him would ever come. She acknowledged his words with a slight nod. As she walked back down the center aisle, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom following her. The atmosphere had completely transformed. What had been embarrassment and discomfort at witnessing someone being dressed down by authority had become something else entirely, a mixture of awe, respect, and vindication. A young woman near the door gave her a subtle thumbs up as she passed. An elderly man stood slightly, a gesture of respect that touched her more than she expected. At the doorway, she paused and looked back at the courtroom. The judge was already calling the next case, but his earlier swagger was gone. His voice was subdued, his posture less imposing. The clerk caught her eye and offered a small, apologetic smile. She stepped into the hallway, letting the heavy door swing shut behind her. The cool air of the corridor was a relief after the tension of the courtroom. She took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her system. Her phone buzzed with a message about tomorrow's security briefing. Reality came rushing back. She had a presidential visit to prepare for, sleep to catch up on, and duties that wouldn't wait for courthouse drama to resolve. As she walked down the marble hallway, her footsteps echoing against the stone, She couldn't help but smile slightly. Sometimes justice came in unexpected ways. The story of what happened in courtroom 3 spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By lunchtime, the tale had grown in the telling. The judge's face hadn't just gone white, some said, but actually green. Others claimed the agent had shown him a special presidential order. One clerk insisted she'd threatened to have the courthouse surrounded. The truth was dramatic enough without embellishment. As she sat in her car in the parking garage, she took a moment to collect herself before driving away. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages about the security preparations, but she allowed herself 30 seconds of stillness. She hadn't meant for things to escalate that way. In all her years of service, she rarely mentioned her job outside of work. She didn't like using her position to gain advantages or special treatment, but sometimes when faced with unfair treatment, there was value in standing up for yourself. The drive to the field office took 20 minutes. Traffic was light, and she used the time to mentally review the presidential visit schedule. She would need to coordinate with local police, arrange security perimeters, and run background checks on everyone who would be near the president. And somehow, she needed to squeeze in a few hours of sleep before the advance team arrived. The security office buzzed with activity when she arrived. Agents moved purposefully between desks, maps covered the walls with colored pins marking key locations, and phones rang constantly. Her team looked up as she entered, their faces showing relief at her return. "How was court?" asked her second-in-command, a tall man with graying hair at his temples. He handed her a coffee without being asked. Black, just the way she liked it. "Interesting," she replied, taking a grateful sip. "I'll tell you about it later." The next few hours passed in a blur of meetings and preparations. They reviewed evacuation routes, discussed contingency plans, and examined photos of the venue. Her team respected her leadership, following her directions without question. None of them knew what had happened in court that morning. To them, she was just their capable team leader, doing her job as she always did. At the end of the day, as the office emptied out, her colleague stopped by her desk again. "You said court was interesting," he remarked, leaning against the doorframe of her small office. "That's not a word people usually use for traffic court." She smiled slightly, tidying the papers on her desk. "The judge was a bit challenging." Challenging? How? She considered for a moment whether to share the story. It wasn't classified information, just personal. But maybe there was value in telling it. "He made some assumptions," she finally said, "about who I was, what I knew. He didn't let me explain about the exemption." Her colleague's eyebrows rose. "So what happened?" "I showed him my badge." He grinned slowly as understanding dawned. "I bet that changed his tune. You could say that." She couldn't help but smile as she remembered the judge's stunned expression. His face went from "how dare you" to "please don't arrest me" in about 3 seconds flat. They both laughed, the sound echoing in the nearly empty office. It felt good to share the moment with someone who would understand. "Some people need reminding that you can't judge a book by its cover," her colleague said, shaking his head. "Especially when the book happens to be one of the best agents in the service." She waved off the compliment, but it warmed her nonetheless. "I'm just glad it's over. Now we can focus on what matters, making sure this visit goes perfectly." As she gathered her things to finally head home for some much-needed rest, she reflected on the day's events. The judge had seen a woman in casual clothes and made assumptions about her intelligence, her understanding of the law, her very worth. But in the end, it wasn't her badge that had proven him wrong. It was her professionalism and dignity in the face of disrespect. 2 days later, the courthouse hummed with its usual activity. Lawyers hurried through hallways clutching stacks of papers. Worried defendants waited on benches, and clerks called out case numbers in monotone voices. But something was different about courtroom 3. The judge who had once ruled his domain with arrogance had changed. Those who appeared before him noticed it immediately. He listened more carefully. He interrupted less. When a nervous young man in ill-fitting clothes struggled to explain his situation, the judge showed unexpected patience. "Take your time," he said, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "The court wants to understand your circumstances fully." The regular courthouse staff exchanged glances. The clerk who had witnessed the confrontation with the Secret Service agent smiled slightly as she organized the day's files. Meanwhile, across town, final preparations for the presidential visit were underway. The agent who had stood her ground in court now stood at the center of a command post, surrounded by security personnel from various agencies. She pointed to locations on a large map spread across the table. "We'll need officers here, here, and here," she explained, marking the spots with red pins. "Sweep teams will clear the route 2 hours before arrival. All building access points need security stationed by 0600. The local police chief nodded, impressed by her thoroughness. He had worked with federal agents before, but her attention to detail stood out. When she spoke, everyone listened. There was a natural authority in her manner that had nothing to do with her title or position. It came from competence and quiet confidence. During a short break, the chief approached her with a cup of coffee. "Heard an interesting story yesterday," he said casually, "about a Secret Service agent who put Judge Reynolds in his place." He raised an eyebrow. "Any chance that was you?" She accepted the coffee with a small smile. "News travels fast." "In this town?" "Lightning speed." The chief chuckled. "That judge has been making people feel small for years, especially women, especially people of color. About time someone stood up to him." She shrugged, uncomfortable with being seen as some kind of hero. "I was just doing my job." "Which is exactly what you were trying to tell him when he wouldn't." "Listen." The chief shook his head. "Sometimes people in power forget that respect goes both ways." Back at the courthouse, the judge sat alone in his chambers during the lunch recess. A letter lay open on his desk, a formal recommendation that he attend a judicial conduct seminar. It wasn't a punishment exactly, but a message had clearly been sent. He hadn't filed a complaint against the agent. In fact, he'd gone out of his way to make sure the incident wasn't officially recorded. But word had spread anyway, as it always did in the close-knit legal community. His colleagues looked at him differently now. Even the bailiff, who had served in his courtroom for 8 years, seemed less deferential. For the first time in his long career, the judge found himself thinking about how he appeared to others. Not just those above him in the judicial hierarchy, but those who came before his bench seeking justice. Had he really become the kind of person who made snap judgments based on appearances? The kind who wouldn't listen when someone tried to explain their situation? The thought was uncomfortable, like a pebble in his shoe that couldn't be ignored. When court resumed that afternoon, a woman in a hijab appeared before him about a parking violation. 6 months ago, he might have been impatient, might have cut her off when she began explaining in accented English. Today he listened all the way through, noting the valid points in her defense. "Case dismissed," he announced, watching her relieved smile with an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. Was this what fairness felt like? Not just following the letter of the law, but its spirit, treating each person with the dignity they deserved. As the woman gathered her papers and turned to leave, the judge cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice softer than usual, "thank you for taking the time to explain your situation fully. The court appreciates your patience." The woman looked surprised, then nodded gratefully before walking away. In the back of the courtroom, the clerk who had witnessed it all hid a smile behind her hand. 1 month later, the presidential visit was just a memory. Life had returned to normal, or almost normal. For the Secret Service agent, the incident in the courtroom had faded into the background of busy days and important assignments. But its impact lingered in unexpected ways. She sat in a conference room at headquarters, surrounded by fellow agents. They had gathered for their monthly training session on professional conduct and implicit bias. Today's topic: authority and respect in public interactions. The instructor, a veteran agent with salt and pepper hair, nodded in her direction. "I heard you had a real-life example of this recently. Would you mind sharing what happened in that courtroom?" She hesitated. The story had apparently traveled all the way up the chain of command. Part of her wanted to downplay it, but another part recognized its value as a teaching moment. It was just a traffic court appearance, she began, feeling the eyes of 20 agents on her. The judge made assumptions about me based on how I looked that day. When I tried to explain the legal exemption that applied, he wouldn't listen. And then, prompted the instructor. I showed him my credentials, she said simply. His attitude changed immediately. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a younger agent spoke up from the back. But why did you have to show your badge at all? The law should have been enough. That was the heart of it, wasn't it? The question that had lingered in her mind since that day. In an ideal world, yes, she replied thoughtfully. But we don't always live in an ideal world. Sometimes people judge us by our appearance, our clothes, our gender, our skin color. They make up their minds about who we are before we even open our mouths. So what's the lesson here? Asked the instructor. She considered the question carefully. I think it's about dignity, maintaining your own, while also extending it to others, even when they don't offer it to you first. She paused. And sometimes it's about knowing when to stand your ground. The discussion continued, agents sharing their own experiences with bias and misconceptions. It wasn't often they had these kinds of honest conversations. Their job was about protection, not introspection. But something about her story had opened a door. Across town, the judge sat in a classroom of his own. The judicial conduct seminar was in its final hour. He'd gone in expecting to be bored or resentful, but found himself taking notes instead, genuinely reflecting on his behavior on the bench. Authority doesn't automatically command respect, the facilitator was saying. True respect must be earned through fair treatment of all who come before the court. The judge thought about the Secret Service agent, how he'd dismissed her before knowing anything about her. He thought about all the others he might have treated the same way over the years, people whose stories he hadn't bothered to hear, whose dignity he hadn't bothered to honor. On his notepad, he wrote, "Listen first, judge second." It was a small change, but perhaps a beginning. Back at headquarters, as the training session wrapped up, the agent gathered her things. A colleague she hadn't worked with before approached her. "That was a powerful story," she said quietly. "Thanks for sharing it. I've been in similar situations and never knew how to handle them." "It's not always easy to know when to reveal your authority and when to hold back," the agent admitted. "I'm still figuring it out myself." They walked together toward the elevator. "The look on that judge's face must have been priceless," her colleague said with a smile. The agent laughed. "It was, but you know what matters more? The faces of the people in his courtroom now, who might be getting the fair hearing they deserve." As the elevator doors closed, she reflected on how a single moment could ripple outward in ways you never expected. She hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson that day in court. She'd just wanted to be heard. But sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for others too. Others who might never have the chance to flash a badge and change the power dynamic in an instant. Sometimes justice wore a badge, and sometimes it wore something much simpler, the courage to demand dignity, even when others try to deny it.